rain had stopped an hour before, but the smell of it remained. That particular scent of wet gravel and old stone that clings to English country houses no matter the century. She stood at the base of the front steps of Ashcombe Hall, 78 years old, gloved hands folded over the head of her cane, and let the smell reach back for her. A brass plaque had been fixed beside the door since her last visit, though she could not read it from this distance without her spectacles. She did not need to. She knew what it said. Subscription library. Open to the public. Established 1852. The house had become, in its old age, exactly what it had once nearly failed to be. "You may go in whenever you're ready, ma'am," said the young woman who had met her at the gate, an archivist by her own introduction, with ink on her fingers and a manner too eager for the quiet the old woman preferred. "There's no charge for former, that is, for anyone with a connection to the house." "There is always a charge," the old woman said, not unkindly. "One simply doesn't always pay it in coin." The girl did not know what to make of that, and did not ask. She turned instead toward the doors, and the old woman followed, her cane finding the worn grooves in the stone steps that 41 years had not erased. Inside, the smell changed. Beeswax now, and paper, and the particular dust of old leather that no cleaning ever entirely removes. It struck her the way certain smells strike the very old, not as memory recalled, but as memory returned to, whole and unbidden, as though no time had passed at all. She had come in through this same door once before, in March of 1830, with her father's satchel of tools over her shoulder and 11 shillings a week, standing between her and want. She had been dismissed within the hour of her arrival, sent, she'd been told, to wait in the servants' passage like a tradesman's girl, which she was. She remembered the exact words used against her that morning. Delivered without heat, without cruelty even, only a cold and total certainty of rank. She had not thought of those words in years. Now, standing in the restored entrance hall with its shelves climbing toward a ceiling she had once seen streaked black with water damage, she found she could recall them as clearly as yesterday's breakfast. "Ma'am," the archivist said gently, "are you quite well?" "Quite," she said. "I was only thinking of the flood." The girl blinked. "There was a flood here?" "Once," the old woman said, and looked toward the far end of the hall where a locked glass case caught the light. "Long before you were born. Long before most things were what they are now." She did not move toward the case yet. There would be time for that. There was, she had learned, always more time than one expected, and always less than one wanted. The archivist did not press further. She had the good manners of the young who have been trained to patience but not yet tested by it, and she busied herself instead with the ledger of visitors' names, leaving the old woman to stand a moment longer in the hush of the hall. Rain had begun again outside, soft against the tall windows, the same rain, she thought, that had fallen 41 years before, though of course it could not have been the same rain at all, only the same season, the same county, the same gray light falling through glass that had once been boarded over with oilcloth and planking while the plaster dried. She let herself remember the coach ride from Larchbury, the one trunk containing her tools, awl, paste-brush, folder of bone, the small knife her father had given her with its handle worn smooth from his own hand before hers. She had been 24 then, unmarried, her father's cough already rattling in his chest each morning like a loose hinge, and 11 shillings a week had seemed, in the weeks before, an almost indecent fortune. The lane to Ashcombe Hall in March of 1830 had been a mire of churned mud and standing water, the hedgerows black and dripping, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and coal smoke drifting low from the chimneys. She remembered the particular cold of that morning. Not a sharp cold, but a damp one that settled into the folds of a cloak and stayed there. She remembered, too, the housekeeper's face when she gave her name at the servants' door, and how the woman had looked past her shoulder as though expecting someone else to emerge from the coach, someone more suitable to the errand of saving 4,000 books. 600 of those books had been ruined outright by the time she arrived. Swollen, blackened, their boards warped like driftwood. The smell of mildew so thick in the east wing that it caught at the back of the throat before one had gone 3 steps down the corridor. She had stood in the doorway of that room, she recalled, and felt something close to grief, though the books were not hers and never would be. It was there, in that ruined room smelling of rot and river water, that she had first been made to understand her place in the household, informed by a voice she had not yet learned to recognize, cold and precise, that she was not to touch the family's private collection, only the general library, and that she would take her meals apart from the rest of the staff, as though her trade rendered her neither servant nor guest, but something unclassifiable, faintly suspect. She had said nothing in reply. She had only set down her trunk, opened it, and begun, with steady hands, to sort what could be saved from what could not. The sorting itself took the better part of that first week. She had learned the discipline of it from her father in the shop on Larchbury's High Street, where the smell of paste and leather had been the smell of her whole childhood. Learned which dampened pages could still be coaxed apart with tissue and patience, and which had fused into solid blocks beyond any hope but the fire. She worked through the mornings in fingerless gloves, for the east wing held the cold of the flood long after the water itself had been carried away, and by noon her hands ached in a manner she did not mention to anyone, least of all to the butler, who brought her tea at 11 each day without being asked and set it down without comment, as though the courtesy might go unnoticed if performed quietly enough. She noticed it nonetheless. She noticed, too, that the household watched her, not unkindly in the main, but with the particular curiosity reserved for a thing not yet decided upon. The housemaids glanced in at the doorway and did not linger. The steward inquired on the 3rd day whether she required a boy to carry the ruined volumes to the yard for burning, and seemed faintly disappointed when she said she would sort them herself, that a book was not always as dead as it appeared from its cover. Of the Marquess, she saw little in those first weeks. He passed through the library twice, once at a distance, crossing the gallery above without pausing, and once nearer, so that she heard his step before she saw him, and had time to compose her face, before he reached the table where she worked. He had looked on that occasion, not at her, but at the books, at the ruin of them, spread across the trestle in various stages of undoing, with an expression she could not then name, though she would come, in time, to recognize it as grief wearing the mask of impatience. He had asked only how long the work would take. She had told him 6 weeks, as agreed, though she had already begun to suspect, turning a swollen spine over in her palms, feeling the give of the boards, and the strange stiffness beneath the leather where the paste had dried wrong against something harder than paper, that 6 weeks would not be enough, that there was more to this library than warped calfskin and water-stained vellum, and that some of what she was uncovering had not been put there by the flood at all, nor, she thought, entirely by accident. The stiffness troubled her more than she allowed herself to admit that first evening, when the household had gone into its supper, and she remained among the trestles with a single tallow candle and the smell of tallow smoke mixing with the sourer smell of mildewed page edges. She turned the volume in question, the great Bible, calfskin gone the color of weak tea where the water had touched it, this way and that beneath the light, running her thumb along the joint where spine met board, and felt again that resistance, faint as a held breath, just beneath the leather. A lesser binder would have thought it warping, nothing more. Her father, in his better years, before his chest had begun its slow betrayal of him, had taught her to read a book's spine the way a physician reads a pulse, and this pulse was wrong. She set the candle closer. She did not cut. That much she would not do without. Permission, whatever her curiosity, for a book damaged twice over was a book she could not answer for. She wrote instead, in the small ledger she kept of her own progress, separate from the household accounts, a private record of hours and materials. A single line. Family Bible, spine, foreign matter suspected. Await further examination, she underlined nothing. She was not, she reminded herself, in the business of drawing conclusions before she had earned them. Marsh found her still there past 10, the candle guttered to a stub, and said nothing of the hour, only set down beside her a cup of tea gone half cold from its journey through the corridors, and a letter that had come that afternoon from Larchbury, which he had, he said, forgotten until now to bring up. She knew the hand before she broke the seal, her father's, though weaker than she liked, the letters leaning where once they had stood upright, and read it standing, by what light remained, learning that he had taken a chill, that the apothecary had been sent for, that she was not, on any account, to trouble herself or hurry home. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it inside her workbox beneath the paring knife and the paste brush where she would not have to look at it again that night. Marsh, watching, asked only whether the tea wanted warming. She said it did not. When he had gone, she returned to the Bible, laid her palm flat upon its ruined cover, and sat a long moment without moving, feeling beneath her hand the two things she could not yet separate, the ordinary damage of water and neglect, and whatever else had been sown, deliberately, into the hidden architecture of the spine, waiting, perhaps for longer than she had been alive, to be found by someone patient enough to look. The candle had burned down to its collar before she moved again, and when she did, it was only to draw the lamp closer and take up the smallest of her blades, the one her father had ground down himself, years before, to a width no wider than a quill. She had learned patience at his bench in Larchbury, learned that a book, like a stubborn animal, would not be hurried into revealing what it held. It must be coaxed, board by board, thread by thread, until it consented. She began at the joint where the old leather had lifted in a long tongue from the boards, blackened at the edge where the flood had reached it, and worked inward with a slowness that would have looked, to anyone watching, like no progress at all. It was there, an hour later, that her blade caught on something that was not glue, nor cord, nor the brittle remains of the original sewing. Something flatter and drier, tucked with evident care between the spine lining and the boards themselves, as though a hand, long dead, had folded it thin on purpose, and pressed it into hiding before the book was ever closed upon it again. She did not pull at it. She sat back instead, wiped her palms upon her apron, and looked at the thing through the lamplight as though it might dissolve if she moved too quickly toward it. Outside, the rain had thinned to something almost gentle against the glass, and somewhere below, in the servants' hall, a clock struck the hour with the flat, patient certainty of clocks that have struck it every night for 100 years and expect to strike it for 100 more. She thought of her father's letter, folded now beneath the paring knife in her workbox, and of how a thing could be preserved by folding, how paper survived where flesh did not, how a hand could vanish from the earth and leave behind only the shape of its own carefulness, waiting in the dark for someone to notice it had been careful at all. She did not send for Marsh. She did not, though she considered it and then set the consideration aside, send word up to the Marquess, who she understood to be still in his study at that hour, over ledgers of his own, though of a colder and more present kind. Instead, she took up a strip of blotting paper, slid it beneath the hidden fold with the same slow, level hand she had used on 100 lesser repairs, and began, thread by careful thread, to ease it free, aware as she worked that whatever this was, it had waited a great many years for exactly this evening, this candle, this particular pair of unhurried hands, and that whatever it said, once said, could not be folded back into the dark again. The fold came away whole, which surprised her. She had expected fragments, the brittle collapse of old paper long asked to bear a crease it had never chosen. Instead, it unrolled with a small dry sound, like a breath let out after being held too long, and lay flat beneath her hand as though grateful to be flat at last. She did not read it at once. She had learned in 6 years of her father's workshop that the worst thing a restorer could do was hurry toward meaning before she had finished protecting the object that carried it, and so she weighted the corners with 4 clean stones kept for that purpose, and only then brought the candle nearer. The hand was old-fashioned, looping, faded to the color of weak tea, and it took her a moment to understand that she was looking at a record of marriage. A date, a parish, two names she did not know, set down beside two she did. Larchbury was written plainly enough that she felt something close under her ribs, some small cold latch springing shut. She had walked past that church 1,000 times. She had been christened in it. She read the page twice more before she permitted herself to think what it might mean beyond itself, and even then she thought of it only in the careful, sideways manner she had been taught to think of dangerous things. Not this proves, not this changes, but merely this exists, and existed before I found it, and will go on existing whether I carry it upstairs or not. The candle had burned low enough that its light no longer reached the far shelves, and in that narrowed circle the room felt smaller than it was, and more exacting. She was aware, distantly, of the house settling around her. A door somewhere, a step on a stair that was not coming toward her, and aware, too, of her own breathing, which she noticed only because she had, for some minutes, been keeping it deliberately quiet, as though the page itself might startle at any sudden movement and refuse to be trusted again. She thought of the cousin, whom she had met only once, in the hall, and who had looked at her the way one looks at furniture one intends to have removed. She thought of Lady Ashcombe's cool civility, which asked no questions because it assumed it already knew every answer. And she thought, last and longest, of the Marquess himself, sitting even now over his own ledgers 2 floors above her, entirely unaware that the coldest room in his house had just grown warmer by exactly 1 folded page. She did not move to call anyone. She sat instead with her hands folded in her lap, the stones holding the paper flat, the candle guttering, and let herself understand, slowly, that she alone now knew something that could unmake a house, and that the knowing of it had made her, whether she wished it or not, no longer merely the woman hired to mend the books. She did not sleep that night, or if she did, it was the shallow, listening sleep of a woman who has left a candle burning somewhere in her mind and cannot quite trust the house to keep it lit. She rose before the maids, before the kitchen fires were drawn, and went down to the library in the gray hour when the windows show more of the garden's ghost than the garden itself. The folded page she had left exactly as she found it, weighted beneath its stones, as though by returning it to stillness she might also return herself to the plainer, safer version of the previous afternoon. The woman who mended paper and asked no questions of it. She did not succeed. The page sat where she had left it, patient and terrible, and she found she could not look at the Bible's spine, gutted and waiting for its new boards, without feeling that it now watched her in return. It was Marsh who found her there, an hour later, with a tray she had not asked for and would not have thought to ask for. Tea and bread cut thin, set down without comment on the one corner of the table not given over to glue pots and thread. He did not ask what kept her. He never asked what kept her. But he lingered a moment longer than the tray required, his eyes moving once, briefly, to the weighted page and away again, and she understood that he had seen it. Perhaps not the words, but the shape of the thing, the particular quality of a secret being kept. "Your father sent word he slept the night through," he said instead, without the cough waking him twice as it did the night before. It was not comfort exactly. It was information, offered the way one offers a coin to a beggar one respects, too much to pity outright, briskly, without lingering on the need behind it. But she felt the whole weight of the night loosen a little in her chest and was grateful, and said so, and he inclined his head and withdrew, leaving her alone again with the tea cooling and the page still folded beneath its stones. She ate without tasting. She thought of the parish register in Larchbury, which she had seen once as a girl, standing at her father's elbow while he mended its cracked cover, the vicar hovering nervous as a hen. She thought that a record kept in one town, 40 miles distant, might undo or confirm what a page hidden in a spine could only suggest. and she thought, with a coldness that surprised her, that she would need to go there herself, and soon, before the knowledge in her keeping curdled into something she could no longer carry alone. Before the Marquess, still ignorant above her, came down to find his coldest room grown too warm to bear. She did not go to him that morning. She told herself it was prudence, and perhaps it was, but there was also a smaller, more stubborn reason she did not examine too closely. She did not yet trust her own face to hold steady before his. A woman who has spent a night with a secret folded beneath stones learns quickly how much of herself shows in the set of her mouth. Instead, she worked. The east wing had dried enough now that she could move the salvaged volumes from the drying racks to the long table without fear of mildew spreading further, and she gave herself to the task with a thoroughness that bordered on penance. Each book lifted, opened, fanned, its foxed pages separated with strips of blotting paper, its spine tested for looseness with 2 fingers pressed gently along the joint. The rhythm of it steadied her the way her father's workshop had always steadied her, the smell of paste and old vellum standing between herself and whatever she could not yet say aloud. Rain fell again past noon, thin and persistent, streaking the tall windows so that the light in the library came gray and shifting, like water seen through water. She was aware, in the periphery of her attention, of the household moving around her. A door somewhere, the cousin's voice raised briefly in the west corridor, and then subdued by Lady Ashcombe's cooler tone, the distant clatter of the kitchen preparing a dinner she suspected she would not be asked to share. She was aware, too, of Marsh passing twice through the gallery on some errand or none, pausing each time near the door as though weighing whether to speak, and each time moving on without doing so. She was grateful for that restraint. She had nothing yet to give him that would not become, in the telling, a burden he had not asked to carry. By late afternoon she had made her decision, though she dressed it in practical clothes so that it would sit easier on her conscience. She would write to her father that evening, asking after his chest as she did each week, and within that ordinary letter she would ask too whether he recalled the vicar at Larchbury, and whether the parish register was kept still in the vestry, and whether a woman traveling alone might reasonably ask to see it without occasioning talk. She turned the wording over twice before she was satisfied it revealed nothing to any eye but her father's, who would understand the shape of what she was not saying, as he always had. She sealed the letter with her own thumb pressed hard into the wax, watching the impression set, thinking that some things, once pressed into the world, could not be softened back to blankness, and that she had perhaps already become one of them. The letter went out with the morning post, carried by a groom who complained, as grooms will, about the state of the roads after rain, though the sky that day was dry as chalk. She watched it go from the schoolroom window that had become, by unspoken permission, her workroom, and told herself that a letter once sent could not be recalled, and that this was no different from any other decision she had made these 6 weeks. A binding taken apart, a page mended, a choice that could not be unmade once the glue had set. She returned to the Bible with hands that did not shake, though she noted, with the detachment she had learned to apply to her own body, that her pulse had not settled since morning. The work itself demanded a slowness that matched her mood. She had reached the innermost gathering, now where the spine's old cords had rotted through and the genealogical leaf lay loose against the boards. Its ink faded to the color of weak tea. She did not touch it again that day beyond what was necessary to keep it from further harm. A fold reinforced here, a tear supported there with tissue no thicker than a moth's wing. For she understood, without needing to be told, that this was not paper to be handled twice, for curiosity's sake. Marsh brought her tea at 4, as had become his habit, and set it down without comment on the state of her concentration, though he lingered a moment longer than usual at the door. "The post has gone out, miss," he said, in the tone of a man remarking on weather. "It has." "To Larchbury, I collect." She did not look up from the frame she was reassembling.
My father likes to hear from me regularly. It eases his mind." "No doubt." He inclined his head, and if there was knowledge in the gesture, he did not press it further, and she was grateful again for a household that had learned, in 6 weeks, when a question was better left unasked. That evening she dined alone, as always, in the small parlor set aside for her use, and found she could not finish the plate before her. She thought of the vestry at Larchbury, which she had visited as a child holding her father's hand, the smell of damp stone and tallow candles, the vicar's careful hand in the register, recording births and marriages back 3 generations. She thought of what it would mean to ask to see it now, a grown woman traveling alone, with a question she could not fully explain even to herself. She banked the fire before retiring, and lay a long while listening to the house settle around her, waiting, though she could not have said for what, before sleep came. She woke before the maid brought water, with the particular clarity that comes to those who have decided something in their sleep without quite knowing it. By the time the light had gone from gray to the pale gold of a March morning, she had resolved to write to the vicar at Larchbury, rather than travel there herself, a compromise between the urgency she felt and the discretion she owed the house that employed her. She composed the letter twice. The first draft asked too much. The second asked almost nothing, only whether the register for the year 1798 might be consulted by a party with a genuine interest in a matter of family record, and whether she might trouble him to copy out, in his own hand, any entry pertaining to a marriage solemnized that autumn. She did not name the parties. She trusted that her father's long acquaintance with the vicar, 40 years of binding his parish books and mending his hymnals, would carry the request further than her own name could. She sealed it before she could reconsider, and gave it to the postboy herself rather than leave it for Marsh to send, though she could not have explained even to herself why this seemed to matter. The days that followed she gave over entirely to the Bible. The vellum leaves, once separated and dried under weighted boards, had begun to take a shape she recognized, not merely restored, but legible again, the illumination along the margins glowing where the mold had once obscured it entirely. She worked with a small brush and a solution of her own devising, thinned gum, Arabic, and the faintest touch of alum, testing each stroke first upon a scrap of similar hide before she trusted it to the true page. The Marquess came twice that week to observe her progress, standing at a distance that had grown, almost imperceptibly, less formal than before. "You work as though the book might feel it," he said once, watching her turn a leaf with both hands flat beneath it, like a woman lifting a sleeping child. "Perhaps it does," she said, "in its way. Vellum remembers moisture for years. It will curl toward water long after the water is gone, if you let it dry carelessly." He said nothing to that, only watched a moment longer before he left her to her work, and she told herself the silence that followed his departure was no different from any other, though she noted, setting down her brush, that her hands were not quite steady, and that she had begun, without deciding to, listening for his step upon the stair each time the house creaked above her. It was Marsh who noticed it first, though he said nothing of it directly. He had taken to bringing her tea at 4 o'clock without being asked, setting the tray upon the small table by the window where the light was best for close work, and he had begun, too, to linger a moment longer than strict duty required, as though gauging the temperature of the room by some instrument other than the thermometer that hung beside the door. "His lordship dines alone tonight," he told her one evening, when she made to leave at 6:30. "He has asked that the fire in the small library be kept lit until 9. She said nothing to this, only nodded and gathered her things, but she understood it for what it was, not an instruction concerning coal, but an intimation that she might, if she wished, remain a little longer over her ledgers in the warmth of that room rather than the draughtier chamber she had been given for her work. She did not remain. She told herself this was prudence, and it was, though prudence had grown harder to distinguish from reluctance. At Larchbury her father's cough had worsened with the turn toward autumn,
and the surgeon's fee for his last visit had eaten into her wages before she had properly begun to think of what remained. She sent word twice a week by the carrier's cart, brief notes, for paper was dear and her father's eyes tired quickly now, and twice a week received in return a hand grown shakier than she liked to admit, assuring her he did well enough, that the widow next door brought him broth, that she was not to trouble herself over an old man's chest. She read these letters standing in the stable yard, where the light was good, and no one thought it strange to see her pause there before returning to the house, and she folded them afterward into the same pocket where she kept her awl and her small scissors, so that the paper grew soft at the creases from handling. Lady Ashcombe, meanwhile, had begun to ask after the Bible's progress with a frequency that suggested less curiosity than unease. "You will tell me directly," she said one afternoon, finding the girl alone in the workroom, "if you discover anything that ought properly to go to the family solicitor rather than sit gathering dust upon your table." It was not quite a threat, delivered as it was with the aunt's customary composure, but neither was it idle. The girl assured her that she would, and meant it, though she had already begun to notice how the spine's inner lining sat oddly thick beneath her fingers in one place. A swelling no water damage alone could account for, and she had not yet decided what she would do when she understood what it concealed. She waited until Lady Ashcombe's footsteps had faded down the gallery before she allowed herself to touch the place again, running the pad of her thumb along the ridge beneath the leather as though the pressure alone might tell her what lay there. It did not. Only patience would do that, the same patience her father had taught her over bread and weak tea in Larchbury, when he showed her how a book's true history was written not in its pages, but in the small deceptions of its binding, a hollow where none should be, a stitch too fine for its century, a board cut from wood that did not match its fellow. She thought of him now, coughing into his handkerchief in the cottage on Miller's Lane, and of the 6 weeks that had already become 7, and told herself this was precisely the sort of discovery for which she had been engaged, nothing more. But she did not send for Marsh, and she did not send for Lady Ashcombe. And when the Marquess himself came into the workroom near dusk to ask, in his flat and unadorned way, whether she required anything further from the estate, before the week's accounts were settled, she found she could not meet his eye while she answered him. "Only more time, my lord," she said, which was true enough, though not the whole of what pressed upon her. He studied her a moment longer than the answer warranted. "You have found something." It was not a question, and she did not pretend otherwise. "I have found a thickness in the spine that ought not to be there. I cannot say more until I have opened it properly, and I would rather not do that hastily, with the light failing and my hands cold. Tomorrow, then." He said it as a man accustomed to giving instruction, yet there was something beneath the flatness, not eagerness exactly, for he permitted himself so little of that, but a kind of held stillness as though he had learned long ago, that wanting a thing aloud only invited its loss. He looked at the Bible on its cradle, at the water-stained boards she had cleaned and oiled until they took the lamplight softly, and for a moment his face carried an expression she had not yet catalogued among his usual economies. Not coldness, not command, but something nearer to dread. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He left without further remark, and she sat a long while after the door had closed, listening to the house settle around her. A maid's step on the back stair, the wind working at a loose shutter somewhere above, and did not open her scissors that night, though they lay ready at her elbow, because she found she wanted, first, to be entirely alone with whatever she was about to learn. The candle guttered twice before she rose to trim it, and in that small domestic act, wick between thumb and forefinger, the smell of tallow sharp in the cold room, she found a steadiness that the day itself had not offered. She had catalogued grief before, in her father's hands when the coughing kept him from his bench, in the widows of Larchbury who brought their husbands' account books to be rebound as though the leather might hold what the men no longer could. She recognized it now in a different quarter, dressed in wool and reserve, and she did not know what to do with the recognition except set it aside, the way one sets aside a tool not presently wanted, trusting it will be there when needed. She did not sleep well. The wind found the loose shutter again near two, and she lay listening to it work at the latch, thinking not of the Marquess's face, but of the spine itself, the telltale thickness along the inner hinge, the slight give where the cords should have run taut and did not. She had felt such swellings before, in humbler books. A pressed flower gone to dust, a lock of hair, once a debtor's promissory note a merchant's widow had begged her to remove before the volume went to auction. Paper hides in spines the way secrets hide in families. She thought this, and then reproved herself for thinking it, as though the thought alone might commit her to some conclusion she had no right yet to hold. Morning came gray and close, the kind of light that flattens everything and asks nothing of the eye. She was in the library before the housemaids had finished the grates, her hands newly washed, her small knife and bone folder laid out with the particular care she gave only to work she feared. The Bible waited on its cradle exactly as she had left it, though someone, Marsh, she supposed, for who else would think to, had set a fresh cloth beneath it in the night, as if in silent acknowledgment that whatever emerged from the binding deserved a clean landing. She worked the old paste free first, patient, unhurried, though her pulse would not agree to unhurriedness, however she instructed it. The leather came away from the board in a long, complaining sigh, and beneath it she saw, at last, what the swelling had promised, a strip of paper, folded small, folded old, the ink upon it browned, but not gone, sewn so deliberately into the join that no binder careless, or in haste, would ever have found it. She did not draw it free at once. She sat with her hands resting lightly upon the ruined boards, aware of her own breathing, aware that whatever she was about to read had been hidden not by accident but by intention. Someone's fear, sewn into calfskin, waiting 40 years for a pair of patient hands. She drew it free at last, not because her hesitation had passed, but because the room had grown too quiet to hold it any longer. The paper resisted at first, brittle at its folds, and she worked it loose the way her father had taught her to work loose anything old and afraid of the light, sideways, never pulling, coaxing rather than commanding. It came away whole. That itself seemed a kind of mercy. She did not unfold it at the table. She rose, crossed to the window where the March light lay gray, and even across the sill, and there, with the glass cold against her knuckles, she opened it. The hand was not recent. It sloped in the manner of an older generation. The letters formed with the deliberate care of someone taught penmanship as a moral discipline rather than a convenience. A date stood at the top, faded but legible, the 11th of June, in a year some 30-odd before her own birth. Beneath it, a record, names, a parish, a witness's mark, set down in the plain, unlovely language of fact. Rather than sentiment, the way a man writes something he intends never to be doubted. She read it twice before she permitted herself to understand what she was reading. Her first thought was not triumph. It was something closer to trespass. The sensation of having opened a door she had no right to open, of standing now in a room built for grief rather than discovery. She thought of the boy of 9 who had lost his mother and, it seemed, very nearly lost her a second time, posthumously, at the hands of men who had never troubled to love her and saw no cost in doubting her. She folded the paper along its old creases as gently as she had unfolded it, and held it a moment against her palm as though testing its weight, though it weighed nothing at all. Below, she could hear the house beginning its morning, a door, a distant voice, the ordinary machinery of a place that did not yet know what had been found in it. She thought of the Marquess at his desk, his ledgers, his composed and guarded face, and understood with a clarity that startled her that what she held would alter him more than any flood, any lawsuit, any cousin's letter ever could. She did not send for anyone. She sat again at the table, the strip of paper before her, and waited, not from indecision, but because some discovery seemed to require a witness chosen with as much care as the paper itself had been hidden. The choice, when it came, arrived without ceremony. She thought first of Lady Ashcombe, whose belief in the cousin's claim had never been unkind, only inherited, the way a family keeps an old grievance, the way it keeps an old clock, because it has always been there, not because it still tells the correct time. She thought of Mr. Pellew, who would want the paper burned twice over could he but touch it, and she thought, longest of all, of Marsh, who had carried tea-trays into this room for 30 years, and had never once asked her what she searched for, though his eyes, she suspected, missed nothing. It was Marsh she sent for. He came within the quarter hour, his tread on the stair unhurried as always, and paused in the doorway with the particular stillness of a man trained to read a room before entering it. He looked at her face, then at the paper on the table, then back at her face. "You have found something," he said. It was not a question. "I have found everything," she answered, and heard in her own voice a steadiness she did not entirely feel. She did not hand him the paper at once. She told him plainly what the strip contained, the date, the parish, the two names entered in a clerk's careful hand, and watched something move behind his composed features, not surprise exactly, but the settling of a suspicion long carried and never voiced. He had served the old Marquess. He had, she understood suddenly, perhaps known something of the truth all along, or guessed it, and had kept his guessing to himself as servants are taught to keep everything to themselves. "His lordship is at breakfast," Marsh said at last. "I know." "He does not like to be disturbed at breakfast." "I know that also." A silence passed between them, companionable in its way, two people weighing the same decision from opposite ends of the same room. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. She could hear a cart on the gravel, a dog somewhere, the ordinary sounds of an estate that had no notion its history was about to be rewritten by a strip of paper, the width of 2 fingers. "I will tell him you wish to speak with him," Marsh said finally, "on a matter concerning the library." It was, she thought, a very small lie, and a very large mercy, for it gave the Marquess no time to arm himself with dread. Before he arrived, only the ordinary irritation of a man interrupted over his eggs. She folded the paper once more, slid it into the worn calfskin cover she had brought up from the workroom for exactly this purpose, and rose from the table, smoothing her skirts with hands that were, she noted with some private astonishment, not quite steady. Marsh held the door. Neither of them spoke again. Together they went down toward the breakfast room, toward the man who did not yet know that the shape of his whole life was about to be handed to him on a strip of paper no wider than a ribbon. The breakfast room smelled of toast and coal smoke, and of the particular dampness that clung to Ashcombe Hall even in its warmest chambers, as though the flood of March had left something behind that no fire could quite burn out. The Marquess sat alone at the long table, a newspaper folded beside his plate, a cup of tea gone still and pale at its surface. He did not look up at once. When he did, it was with the faint, weary courtesy of a man who expected to be told of a broken casement or a delayed delivery of coal. "Marsh says you have found something," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but the mildest curiosity, the tone of a man discussing weather. She set the calfskin cover on the table before him, not opening it yet. Her hands, she was relieved to find, had steadied themselves somewhere between the workroom and this room, as though the walk itself had been a kind of discipline. "I have, my lord." "In the spine of the Bible." He glanced at the cover, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted. Not alarm yet, only the small recalibration of a man who has learned, through long practice, to distrust good news arriving too quietly. He set down his cup. "Go on." She opened the cover and drew out the strip of paper, laying it flat upon the white cloth between the toast rack and the untouched marmalade, where the morning light through the tall windows fell directly upon it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at a letter he has waited 18 months to receive and has stopped, somewhere in that waiting, believing it would ever come. "It is a register entry," she said, "copied by a clerk's hand and witnessed. It records a marriage, my lord, at St. Anne's in Larchbury. In the spring of the year your mother—" She stopped herself, chose the plainer words. "The year before you were born." He picked it up then. She watched him read it once, quickly, the way a man reads bad news to have it over with, and then again, slowly, the way a man reads something he is afraid to have misunderstood. Outside, the dog barked twice and fell silent. The cart on the gravel had gone still. "This was sewn into the spine," he said at last, not quite a question. "Hidden there. Deliberately, I think. The stitching was too fine, and too recent, to be the original binder's work." He set the paper down with a care that seemed to cost him some effort, as though his hands, like hers earlier, required instruction to remain steady. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence in the room was not empty but full, crowded with 18 months of lawyers in doubt and a dead father's quarrelsome sister, all of it balanced now on a strip of paper the width of 2 fingers. "You are certain," he said, "that the hand is your father's period. Not later. Not—" He did not finish the sentence, but she understood its shape. Not forged. Not a kindness invented by a woman who needed 11 shillings a week and a reason to keep earning them. "The ink has bitten into the vellum the way old ink does," she said. "New ink sits on the surface, my lord, proud of it, like a guest who has not yet learned the house. This has sunk in and stained the fibers below. I could show you under the glass, if you wished it. But I do not think you need the glass to see it." He did not need the glass. She could tell this from the way his eyes had gone to the signature at the foot of the page and stayed there, as though by looking long enough he might extract from the loops and crossings of a stranger's pen some assurance the words themselves could not give him. "Witnessed by a curate long dead," he said, "and a woman whose name means nothing to either of us." "It will mean something to the parish register at Larchbury," she said. "Registers do not forget. They only wait to be asked." He looked up at that sharply, as though she had handed him something he had not thought to want until it was in his grasp. "You would go yourself to Larchbury." "I know the church," she said. "I know the sexton, a little. He buried my mother, my lord, and complained the whole while of his knees. If the record exists, it will be in his keeping, and he will not charge you a lawyer's fee to look at it." Something moved in his face then. Not quite a smile. Too tired for that. But the shadow a smile leaves behind when it has decided not to arrive. "You have thought of this already." "I have had all morning, my lord, while you were deciding whether to ring for me." He did not answer that directly. He rose instead, crossed to the window, and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the wet gravel and the cart standing idle where the coachman had left it, forgotten in the sudden stillness of the house. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the raw edge it had carried since she had unrolled the paper before him. "My aunt will say it proves nothing. Pelew's men will say the same, and say it louder, because they are paid to." "Then let them say it to the register," she answered, "and not to a strip of paper I found sewn into a book. Paper can be doubted. A parish clerk's own hand, 40 years dry, is harder to argue with." He turned from the window at last, and for the first time since she had come into the room, he looked at her not as a bookbinder's daughter hired by the week, but as though she had said something he intended to remember. "Then we go to Larchbury," he said. They went that same afternoon, though the sky gave no sign of relenting, and the lanes between Ashcombe and the market town had turned to a soft brown porridge that sucked at the carriage wheels. He said nothing for the better part of an hour, sitting with his gloved hands folded on his knee, watching the hedgerows slide past streaked with rain. She sat opposite, the strip of paper wrapped in oiled cloth and held against her as though the damp might yet undo what 40 years of a spine's darkness had preserved. "You are certain of the hand," he said at last, not quite a question. "I am certain it is old," she said. "I am certain it was written by someone accustomed to writing marriage lines, and not by someone forging them for a stranger's Bible a century later. Beyond that, my lord, it is the clerk's book that must speak, not mine." He accepted this with a small motion of the head, and looked out the window again, and she understood that he had asked not because he doubted her, but because the waiting itself had become unbearable, and speech was the only harness he had for it. Larchbury received them with the particular blankness of a town that does not expect a marquess's carriage on a Tuesday. The clerk, roused from his dinner, was an elderly man with ink-stained fingers and a manner that grew visibly more careful once he understood whose signature he was being asked to search among his registers. He led them down into a room that smelled of tallow and old paper, and drew out a volume bound in the same plain brown calf her father had once repaired for a shilling, and set it upon the table between them. The Marquess did not sit. He stood with one hand braced against the table's edge, while the clerk turned the pages with maddening deliberation, wetting his thumb, murmuring dates under his breath. She watched the Marquess's face rather than the book, and saw the exact moment his composure narrowed to a single point, like a man watching a door he cannot yet see through. "Here," the clerk said. The entry was plain. A name, a date, a witness's mark beside it, and it matched, line for line, the strip of paper she had drawn from the spine of a ruined Bible 3 weeks before. The Marquess bent over it a long moment without speaking. When he straightened, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. 30 years, he said. They let my mother be spoken of as though she had invented her own marriage. She did not invent it, she said. She only trusted it would keep. He looked at her then with an expression she could not name. Not gratitude exactly, nor relief, but something rawer, as if a door long braced shut had given an inch under ordinary pressure. Outside, the rain had begun again against the clerk's narrow window, and neither of them moved to leave. The clerk copied the entry twice, once for the court, and once, at the Marquess's quiet insistence, for her father, though her father had asked for nothing and would likely never read it, his eyes having grown too dim that autumn for anything but the largest print. She did not say this aloud. She folded the copy into her reticule instead, and thought of the shop on Cross Street, its shelves gone quiet under dust these 6 weeks, and felt the particular ache of a debt she could not yet name repaid. They rode back to Ashcombe Hall in a silence that was not the old silence, not the clipped, guarded stillness of March, but something worn soft by use, like a strap handled every day until it no longer chafed. The rain followed them the whole way, streaking the carriage glass, and once, when the wheels struck a rut and threw her against the seat's hard bolster, she felt his hand catch her elbow before she had even registered the fall. He withdrew it at once. Neither remarked upon it. Lady Ashcombe received the news in the small parlor with her embroidery still in her lap, and for a long moment said nothing at all, her needle suspended above the linen as though she might yet find some flaw in the register's ink. Then she set the frame aside entirely. "Mr. Pellew will contest the copy," she said, "before he concedes the original." "Let him," the Marquess answered. "The original stands in Larchbury, and will stand there whether he concedes it or not." Lady Ashcombe looked at her then, not at her son's face, though he was not her son, but at the bookbinder's daughter standing near the door with rain still drying in the hem of her gown, and something in the older woman's expression, some last reserve of doubt, seemed quietly to fold itself away. "You have done this house a service," she said, "that I did not think a girl from a bindery could do." It was not warmth precisely, but it was not the voice of March either. The cousin's letter arrived within the fortnight, brittle with legal phrases and thinner courtesies, disputing nothing outright, but reserving, as his solicitor phrased it, all rights pending further inquiry. The Marquess read it once at breakfast, and set it beside his plate without comment, and later she found it in the library grate, only half consumed, the paper curling black at its edges the way the Bible's pages once had, though this time no one moved to save it. The library itself stood nearly whole again by All Souls. Shelves reordered, spines mended, the smell of new leather and cedar oil replacing the old damp rot. She had thought, once the last book was returned to its place, that her 6 weeks would end, and she would go back to Larchbury, and the shop, and whatever quiet life waited there. But the Marquess had said nothing yet of an ending, and neither, she noticed, had she asked. November came in on a wind that stripped the last leaves from the lime avenue, and still she remained. The pretext, when one was needed, was thin enough to see through. A catalogue to complete, a set of estate ledgers water-stained beyond the flood's original reach, dozens small tasks that might have occupied a fortnight and instead occupied a season. Marsh brought her tea each afternoon at 4 without being asked, and did not remark upon the lengthening of her stay, though once setting down the tray, he observed that the house had not smelled of beeswax and old paper in this particular combination since her ladyship's time, and then said nothing further, as though the sentence had cost him something to finish. Her father's letters came weekly from Larchbury, his hand grown thinner and more deliberate with each one, as though each word were laid down with care against the possibility it might be his last. He wrote of the shop, of a customer's account still unsettled, of the cough that would not leave his chest, though the weather had not yet turned truly cold. She read these letters standing by the library window, where the light was best, and folded them afterward into the pocket of her apron rather than her writing desk, as if keeping them near the body might keep him near it too. The Marquess found her there one such afternoon, the letter still creased in her hand, and he did not ask its contents. He asked instead, with the particular carefulness he reserved for questions that were not quite the question he meant, whether her father had ever wished her apprenticed to some other trade, millinery, perhaps, or a governess's post, something less bound to dust and mending. He wished me safe, she said. He did not much mind at what. And are you safe? She considered the word as though it were a stitch she might have to unpick. Safe enough, she said, for a bookbinder's daughter in a marquess's library. It was meant lightly, and did not land so. He turned from her toward the window, and for a moment the old coldness seemed to gather in his shoulders again, though when he spoke his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. I have found, he said, that safety is a thing one arranges for others long before one troubles to arrange it for oneself. She did not ask whom he meant, his mother, perhaps, or the father 18 months in his grave, or some private ledger of losses he kept as carefully bound as any book on these shelves. But she understood, standing there with her father's letter warm from her own hand, that his coldness had never been indifference. It was arithmetic, a man counting what he could afford to want, and finding the sum, each time, came out against him. She said nothing to this arithmetic, for there was nothing in it that wanted contradiction, and she had learned by then that his silences were not walls so much as ledgers of their own, columns he was still totting in his head. She returned to the table where the Bible lay open, its vellum drying under the weighted cloths she had set that morning, and she resumed the small blind work of a needle drawn through old skin, because it was the only language she had ever trusted to say what she meant without saying too much. He did not leave the room. He stood some minutes at the window with his hands behind his back, watching the rain gather itself into rivulets on the old glass, and when he spoke again, it was of nothing consequential. The state of the drive, the likelihood of frost before December was out, whether Marsh had yet sent word to the glazier about the east casement. She answered in kind, and there was, in this exchange of small dry facts, something that felt nearer to ease than any of their earlier conversations had managed. as though both of them had agreed, without a word passing to confirm it, to let the larger matter rest a while longer between them, folded and put away like a letter not yet answered. It was Lady Ashcombe who broke the quiet an hour later, arriving with her shawl damp at the shoulders and her expression sharpened by whatever errand had kept her from the house since morning. She looked from the Marquess to the woman bent over her needle and back again, and something in her face, not quite a smile, not quite its opposite, suggested she had arrived at a reckoning of her own. "I have had a letter from Mr. Pellew's solicitor," she said, without preamble. "He proposes a settlement. He will withdraw the suit for a sum, and a public acknowledgment that the matter was never proven either way." The Marquess turned from the window. "And you advise?" "I advise nothing," said his aunt. "Until the register at Larchbury is copied and sworn, and until this—" She gestured at the Bible on its cradle, at the woman's hand still and watchful above it, "is beyond all further mending or unmending. A settlement now would be a door left ajar. I did not spend 18 months disliking a claim to see it merely postponed. There was in this something that might almost have been an apology, offered sideways, to the woman she had once dismissed as an inconvenience beneath the family's notice. The heroine did not look up to receive it, only bent lower over her work, though her hands, for the first time that day, had gone still, listening as she had learned to listen to old bindings for the sound of a thing about to give way. The stillness did not last. Lady Ashcombe withdrew, her skirts making their dry, deliberate sound against the floorboards, and the room settled back into the hush of paper and paste. The Marquess did not follow her out. He remained at the window a moment longer, and then, as though the conversation had cost him something he was unwilling to name, he crossed the room and stood at the far end of the table, not too near, watching the heroine's hands resume their work. "You heard all of that," he said. "I did. And you have no opinion to offer, as she had none to spare?" She lifted the spine she had been coaxing free of its old glue, turned it once in the light, set it down. "I have an opinion about paper, my lord, about whether the ink on a register 31 years old will hold when copied, and whether the parson at Larchbury keeps his books dry. Beyond that, I have learned not to offer what is not asked. I am asking." She looked at him then, not long, not searching, only the brief level glance she gave a binding before deciding how it must be cut. "Then I think a settlement now would tell the world you feared the truth would not bear looking at. I think Lady Ashcombe is right, though I do not think she is right for your sake alone." "For whose, then?" "For the sake of the name that will be written in that register, whoever bears it after. A door left ajar stays ajar for the next storm, not only this one." He said nothing to that, but something in his jaw loosened, some tightness. She had come, over the weeks, to read as clearly as foxing on a page. He picked up from the edge of the table the small brass tool she had left cooling, the one she used to let her spines, and turned it over in his fingers as a man might turn over a coin whose value he was only beginning to credit. "My father," he said at last, "would have taken the settlement. He preferred a quiet lie to a loud truth. I never knew your father, my lord." "No," he said, "you did not." And there was in the flatness of it not accusation, but something closer to relief, as if her ignorance of the old Marquess were itself a kind of mercy, a page not yet written upon, on which some other history might still be set down. He replaced the tool exactly where he had found it, with a care she had not expected of him, and for a moment neither spoke, while outside the window the light thinned toward evening, and somewhere below a groom called the hour to the stable clock, indifferent to all of it. The letter, the register, the woman at the table, the name not yet secured. October came in on a wind that stripped the last leaves from the avenue in a single night, and with it came the men of law. 2 of them, dry and precise, sent by the cousin to inspect what they termed, without apparent irony, the disputed article. She was permitted to remain in the room only because the Marquess insisted upon it, a fact Marsh reported to her in the pantry with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict already decided. He said, miss, that no one else in this house had earned the right to be present at its unmaking or its mending. Those were his words. I set them down after, so as not to lose them. She did not ask why he had troubled to remember them for her. In the library, the two men turned the parish register beside the Bible's genealogical leaf, comparing hand to hand, ink to ink, with the cold thoroughness of men paid by the hour. Lady Ashcombe stood apart at the window, her back very straight, and said nothing at all, which was, from her, its own admission. Mr. Pellew was not present. He had sent his solicitors in his stead, as though the matter were beneath the indignity of his own eyes, though she suspected it was instead beyond the courage of them. The elder of the two men looked up at last, and said, in the voice of a man reading weather rather than fate, "The hands agree, the dates agree. I see no defect here that would not stand before any court in the kingdom." He said it the way one might remark upon a fair crop, and the room, which had held its breath for 8 months, let it out all at once. Though no one moved, no one embraced, no one wept, it was not that kind of house. The Marquess crossed to the table and laid his palm flat upon the Bible's cover, not reverently, but as a man might lay his hand upon a door he has finally been permitted to close. "Then it is finished," he said. "It is proved," she said. "Whether it is finished, my lord, is another question." He looked at her a moment longer than the remark required, and something in his face, she would think of it often, in years to come, without ever quite naming it, loosened, the way a knot loosens not from being pulled, but from being, at last, no longer needed. Lady Ashcombe turned from the window then, and crossed the room, and said to her quietly, so that only she could hear, "You have given him back more than a title, girl. See that you do not undervalue what you have done." It was not thanks. It was, from that woman, something nearer to it than thanks had ever come. The old woman closed the ledger of memory there, as she always did before allowing herself the rest, and let the archivist's voice draw her back into the present, into the hush of shelves and dust and the particular gray light of a November afternoon in 1871. "There is one more thing," the young woman said, "that I ought to show you before you go." She had already run her thumb along the spine, had already found the 2 sets of initials tooled into the leather side by side, E.H. and the Marquess's own mark, worked there by some binder's hand she had never asked after. She had not needed to ask, but the archivist was easing the cover back now, turning to the inner hinge where the old glue had softened with age, and drawing out, with the careful patience of someone who had been trained to touch such things as though they might still bleed, a small folded paper, brittle, at its creases the ink gone, the color of weak tea. "It was sewn into the binding," the archivist said. "We found it only last spring, when the book came in for cleaning. We did not know who to send it to. We did not know there was anyone left to send it to." The old woman took it. Her hands, spotted now, no longer certain, did not shake. They had learned their steadiness in a workshop in Larchbury 60 years before, and some things a body does not forget. To E.C.H., it read, in a hand she had not seen in 11 years, since the spring he died, who mended what I could not bear to look upon, and in doing so mended more than she knew. I was not cold from cruelty. I had buried a mother, and then a father, and I had learned that what a man loves, he loses. I did not dare to love the library, for fear of losing it. I did not dare to love you, for the same fear, until I could no longer help it. If you read this, it is because I am gone before you, and I find I do not mind it so very much, having said, at last, what I could not say alore at the time. Thank you. December, 1830. She sat with it a long while, in the chair by the window where the light fell as it had always fallen, on paper, on old bindings, on the particular dust of years. The archivist did not speak. Somewhere below, a bell rang for closing. Outside, the gravel drive was wet with the first rain of the season, and the beech trees had gone the color of old vellum, and the house behind her held its 4,000 volumes, and one Bible, and one letter, the way it had always held what mattered, quietly, and without complaint, waiting for someone patient enough to notice.